Welcome to Everything Change, Croeso I NEWID POPETH, 10 days of talks, conversations, readings and performances about creativity and adaptive thinking in response to the climate and ecological crises. When it comes to drastically reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and protecting biodiversity, we largely know and have known for a long time what we have to do. The challenge facing us now, therefore, is perhaps more one of the imagination than of action. How might we, as individuals, nations, as species, imagine a different way of being on this planet? How might we imagine a fairer, healthier future for ourselves, our children, and the natural world upon which we rely to survive? How might creativity across the arts, sciences, business, law, policy, activism, education help make that future feel not just vital, but possible? These are some of the questions that we'll be exploring in Everything Change, through artistic provocations, events with two of the world's leading writers, and 7 interdisciplinary conversations across 7 crucial areas of change: money, food, water, energy, justice, story, and change itself. A just transition to a sustainable one planet form of living will mean radically changing our relationships with finance, wealth distribution, the economics of perpetual growth, and the very concepts of cost and worth. So how do we make that happen? What is the role of high finance in creating a greener, low-carbon society? How will businesses thrive in a post-growth world? And what new models and ideas might best alleviate poverty? Thank you for joining us for this first Everything Change panel discussion, in which we'll be exploring how money might be part of the solution to the climate crisis, not just part of the problem. Chaired by author and sustainable business journalist Oliver Balch, this is Changing Money.
Hello, my name's Oliver Balch. It is a great pleasure to be with you here today for the first panel event in this wonderful series. I'm so looking forward to not just our session, which is going to be the best, but the others that will come in the next 10 days. I spent 20 years writing on sustainability issues, particularly through a business lens, and invariably I end up talking to men in suits with ties that generally work within 1 square mile of the centre of London. And it's so important and so refreshing to hear from other voices from across different spectrums. And that's exactly what this whole Everything Change series of events and talks and artistic contributions is designed to do. So brilliant, it's great. And if you've taken time off, if you're taking your lunch early, thank you for doing that. If you've skipped off work to do this, even better, disrupt the system. That's what we're all about. And if you're sitting on your sofa wondering what this is all about, well, let's find out. None of us really know. We're going to ask the questions. I can't promise answers. I've asked our panelists to be idealistic and visionary, but also to try and ground things in the practical as well, so we have some things to take away with us. But in the spirit of alternative, fresh, creative thinking, we have Oana Aristide with us. She's one of our 4 panelists. She has an amazing background. I think, if I've got it right, born in Transylvania, brought up in Sweden. Now I think you're running a hotel somewhere gorgeous like Greece. But you're a macroeconomist by training. You've worked as an economic advisor and as a chief economist in the city, and written for The Economist, and done loads of things. And you've written this wonderful book called Under the Bloom, which I read in The Guardian is beautifully written and emotionally gripping. I'm looking forward to getting a copy myself. I'm here in Portugal. Where are you, Oana?
Hello, Oliver. I'm in Greece.
You're in Greece. Brilliant. Look, without further ado, do please speak up because you're a tiny bit faint, but we're going to have our artistic provocation to kick things off from Oana, and it's called The Cryptocurrency Experiment. Over to you.
Currency experiment, a dialogue. We care about the environment. Everyone cares about the environment. I go to marches, I donate.
You invest in cryptocurrency.
How?
It doesn't matter how I know. You can't say you care about the environment while investing in one of the most environmentally damaging industries.
People are making tons of money from crypto.
Fine, but don't pretend you care.
I do care. I just do other things to help the environment. I've got a small child. Financial security is vital. You can't blame me for trying to make the most of my savings.
A human's environmental footprint is enormous. You cannot seriously say that because you are recycling, it's okay to invest in one of the most polluting industries.
I don't think it's fair to be so negative about cryptocurrency. Why don't we look at how much energy goes into our banking system?
You are saying that if banking today consumes more energy than cryptocurrency, then crypto is okay.
I know where you're getting at. You say that this is just an incipient industry, and of course banking consumes more.
Not only that, when we compare the two, we need to define how much more it is acceptable for the traditional banking system to consume to still be considered more climate friendly.
Sure, what do we look at? The value of banks versus the value of cryptocurrency?
We should look at what both of them give back per unit of energy consumption. The global financial system hires tens of millions of people and facilitates all the transactions that underpin the global economy. The value added per unit of energy consumption is incomparably greater than for crypto, which performs zero services for the global economy, hires very few people, and just enriches some individuals who can afford to take the risk, all the while consuming vast amounts of energy. We would need many planets to support a cryptocurrency industry that would offer the same return in terms of jobs and infrastructure as the existing financial system.
I didn't know you were such a fan of banks.
I'm not. I just think they are far less damaging than this industry, and they already exist.
I've asked some people, I presented them with your arguments, and there are many ways in which you're getting things wrong or jumping to conclusions.
Enlighten me.
For one, this industry is energy intensive now, but it can be a catalyst for energy efficiency once it becomes important. It will need so much energy that it will have to find an environmentally sustainable energy source. It can be a driver for renewables and so on.
This is not what tends to happen once an industry becomes dominant. None of the growth of renewables has been pushed by industries that would, in theory, benefit from them. The car industry has developed electric vehicles after being pushed by legislation and punitive taxes. The oil industry has done everything possible to deny climate change and perpetuate the use of oil. Renewable energy has only expanded in the face of huge resistance from vested interests, and it's still very much the less used energy source. It is unnecessary to gamble on this, to create a new industry that is alarmingly energy intensive in the hope that it will become energy efficient once it is big enough.
You'll be pleased to hear I moved my money out of Bitcoin and into this other crypto thing that is environmentally sustainable. Their prospect says they are consuming a fraction of the energy of Bitcoin.
Is this it? They are saying they are more environmentally friendly than Bitcoin.
I guess so.
And you believe this is relevant?
Why wouldn't it be?
Because almost every industry except the oil industry is more environmentally friendly than Bitcoin. If a company makes the statement less energy intensive than Bitcoin, it's because it can't truthfully say it is less energy intensive than anything else.
You don't know that.
In marketing, anything that gives you a competitive edge is gold. If any cryptocurrency were able to compare itself favorably with a traditional industry, it would say so.
Still, the fact that people prefer a cryptocurrency that is less energy intensive gives an incentive to all the others to be less energy intensive.
They are counting on people like you being greedy, but also wanting an excuse to make you feel good about yourself. That's why greenwashing works. You are all very happy to accept the first excuse that something environmentally damaging is actually fine. When what everyone should know, the greedy tiny investor, the greedy large investor, and the greedy creators of crypto, is that you all have more excuses than you have time.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you very much, Oana, and thank you to your friend, the artificial intelligence man, Taliesin X. Where I was trying to place the accent. Where is it? Swedish accent? Was it? Was it a?
It's a fellow Romanian and Londoner.
Okay, got you. It was just terrific. It was such a good place to start this conversation. And what I took from that, from your creative presentation, was the challenges that we all face. Right, we want to do the right thing, but it's so confusing, and this whole space is full of contradictions and paradoxes and gaming by vested interests. And I think it's just a great way to kick off the discussion that I hope we'll have now. And so to give you an idea of how the next 50 minutes will pan out, we have 3 other panelists who I'll introduce you to now. Each will give some top level thoughts about what they think, where the problem lies and how it might be fixed. And then we'll throw some ideas around, and we're really keen to get questions from you as well. So this is properly interactive, and you can put those in the chat column there on the side. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll turn it over at the end to questions from you guys. Let me introduce our panel. First, we have Emily Bacon, who is from Swansea's School of Management. Hi, Emily. I'm going to ask everyone where they are. I sort of gave a clue that you're from Swansea Management. Are you in Swansea? Do we find you in Swansea?
I am indeed. A very rainy Swansea. I wish I was in Greece with Oana or somewhere far more tropical.
And you're a specialist in circular economy, is that right? You're a lecturer on circularity.
Yes, indeed. A new endeavour. My background is in innovation networks, but started learning about the world of circular economy and became fascinated with the new way of thinking that it proposes.
Fabulous. We look forward to hearing from you in a second. And Suzanne Dhaliwal. Are you there? This is all the...
Hi.
Hey, there's a slight delay, isn't there? You've got to find the unmute button as well, but it's great to see you. So you've got a crazy bio as well. I couldn't work out exactly. You're an artist, a creative, activist, writer, a bit of everything. You founded the UK tar sands campaign group. Did I miss anything?
No, that's it. And I think something I'll be talking about a lot is just the work we've been doing already in the environmental movement to reimagine and transform economies based on the human rights impacts of the climate crisis as well.
Brilliant. That's such an important angle. And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm on the island of Korčula in Croatia at the moment. Nice.
Let's see if Shameran and Abed, our 4th panelist, can up the game in terms of geographical location. Shameran, you're Senior Director at BRAC, which is a microfinance institution, and you work specifically with this segment of the economy. It's often missed by the consumer brands, the ultra poor. Well, tell us first, where are you and how do you define ultra poor?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Oliver. I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Good afternoon, everyone. I work for BRAC. BRAC does a lot of work in financial inclusion and microfinance, but it's broader than that. It's a global nonprofit. We work across Asia and Africa, based out of Bangladesh, and and we work across health, education, rights, gender, agriculture, all of those fields. I particularly work on financial inclusion and also our work on extreme poverty with a focus on ultra poverty. And ultra poverty is basically the poorest subset of people in extreme poverty. I mean, people who are they're almost invisible even if you walk around very poor communities because they're so vulnerable, so marginalized. And we have some specific programming, and we're also trying to advocate for more resources, but better forms of programming and interventions to pull people in those levels of almost dehumanizing poverty to move up to a position where they can actually.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Terrific. And you were a barrister by background. You were back in the day. Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well. Shall we kick off? Emily, can you share your headline thoughts to get us going today? Over to you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start my statement today by sharing with you the table that's in my office at home. This table was gifted to me by my mum when I first moved into my house and didn't really have a lot of money. And it was given to my mum by my grandmother, and it's been in my family for years. And as a child, I would turn it on its side and use it as a steering wheel when I was playing. And this is not a new way of thinking, right? This has been in circulation for centuries, where family heirlooms are gifted to people and resources are kept in use. And this is one of the fundamental aspects of the circular economy, where resources are kept in use for as long as possible and materials are built to last. The problem that we have is that our society and business models are grounded upon selling more products to consumers and people buying more, rather than using what's readily available or repurposing items to fit their requirements. And so we have this constant society of consumerism that is not doing much good for our planet. Global resource use by 2050 is expected to double what it is now. So you can imagine the amount of products that are going to be in use by that time. The solution to this problem is by far not an easy one. I listened to a talk recently by Andy Rees, who is head of waste strategy at Welsh Government, and he proposed a model of resource use that looks at individuals having a certain degree of expenditure or allowance that they can spend on food or travel or clothes. But once they've reached their limit, they then have to introduce circular principles to their purchasing. So taking a ferry instead of a plane, or reusing what's in their fridge. That would be a lovely model to introduce, but I'm not sure that we're right there yet at the moment. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today, thinking about solutions to these key problems, and ultimately making a circular economy a reality.
Brilliant. Yeah, solutions aren't easy, as you say. Suzanne, give us your what are you passionate about, and what would you like to see change?
Yeah, great. I think when we think about the future and we think about change, it's also really important for us to bring history into the context. So when we're talking about the climate crisis, we're talking about the crisis of colonialism and extractivism and devastation of territories and lands that's been going on, for hundreds of years. So, as we're moving towards imagining the future, we have to take stock and understand how we got here. So if we think about globally, about the biosystems, the ecosystems that we need to keep intact, 80% of those are actually protected by indigenous peoples, by tribal peoples. And so for me, the centrality has been around supporting indigenous rights, supporting communities that are trying to protect that land. So it's really important for people coming to the climate movement to understand that, myself personally, I've been involved in a decade of work where we've been looking at, heavy fossil fuels such as tar sands, deep sea drilling, fracking, and we've been trying to trace the accountability. I think that's a really important phrase in this, is who is accountable for this? So there are legal accountability with that. The colonial British government, which is responsible for land displacement, for tensions in regions. So there's that legal part, but there's also the corporate and financial accountability. So for me, that's meant tracing the money back to banks such as Royal Bank of Scotland, to the corporations. And for the last 10 years, we've been going into those shareholder meetings, to those annual general meetings, and making the argument that these projects are not viable, not just because of the future carbon accumulated with them, but the existing human rights abuses that have already taken place. So a lot of my work has been in Alberta, Canada, in the Breel Forest, and already that area is a wasteland. It will never be remediated. So we have a situation there also where a lot of those projects are illegal. So these are investments in illegal projects which never actually had the free, prior and informed consent of communities. So I think that's a really important baseline of work that we already have. For the last 10 years, these banks, these corporations know that these projects, and also to send that shockwave to the community, to the financial community that, you know, investing in tar sands, investing in heavy oil, it's just not a good investment for your portfolio, for your pensions as well. So that history is really important for us to imagine as we move forward. And we've also been working in the last few years around insurance as well. And if we look at the history of the insurance industry, Lloyd's was based upon slavery. So, you know, if we're thinking about these future economies, if we're thinking about crypto, why they've come into being is to cut the ties with these economic systems, such as, you know, these economic entities which are based in slavery as well. So we can't just be counting the parts per million. We can't just be thinking about the climate impacts. We have to think about autonomy. We have to think about how we're going to get land back, land rights back, and how we're going to shift that capital. The other thing to say is that as a woman of color doing this work in the environmental movement, it's one of the least diverse industries that is there, second least diverse. So there's also about the capital and how it moves within the industry itself. So for instance, someone like myself, that's why I've got so many hats, is because it's not actually sustainable to be a climate justice campaigner. So we also need to think about how is money flowing within the non-profit industrial complex. And that's why personally, why I've turned to coins like Doge and other spaces where even though we know there's an environmental impact, we're having to be innovative to think about where are we going to get the capital for the humanitarian crises that are happening now. And that's something that's been emerging to try and think about how do we respond to coronavirus, cyclones, when we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the money in the non-profit industrial complex to respond to that. So I think moving forward, it's important that we understand the legacies of the financial institutions that we're challenging. It's important to know the history of the climate movement and the work that's already been done, and also the centrality of rights, land rights, and responding to the humanitarian disasters that are happening now. You know, in the Sundarbans, I know there was another cyclone that just happened. There was one last year and there was zero response to that. So I think there's a whole, those are some of the problems and the creativity that we need to move forward.
Brilliant. Can I just ask you a quick qualifying question? And it comes from my introduction saying I spent 20 years talking to basically these well-meaning, but very white, very Caucasian, very sort of established figures. They're in established organizations. What's the downfall of that kind of continued colonial dominance of discourse? What do you see as the biggest failing there?
Yeah, I think, well, if you think about it, you can't solve a problem with the mentality that created it. So if we're relying upon those people having that compassionate response to care about that, they only care if it's not financially viable. So that's why we also have to make the human rights cases, and we need to be coming up with simultaneously other systems as well. But I would say it's important for the movement itself to do that stock take. Do we even have those voices within the movement to do that? And the last part would be, where does the catastrophes that are already unfolding and the humanitarian responses lie, if it's mainly, you know, middle class white people in London not actually having that heart connection to the existing crises as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Suzanne, you've spent 10 years following the money, trying to work out how this money is being spent for bad ends. I think, Shameran, you're the other side of the coin. You're trying to grasp some of this money back and disperse it with more pro-poor positive ends. Tell us a bit about what you do and what concerns you and the solutions you're trying to offer, all in 3 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you know, Suzanne, our work is very different, but that's a great segue, because I was going to say, if you're in this part of the world, I mean, the crises are already here. I mean, we're seeing more cyclones, we're seeing more flooding. And also there's the slow onset humanitarian disaster that's happening in parts of Bangladesh and India, with sea level rise and salinity coming upstream and completely destroying lives and livelihoods of millions of people. And so for me and the work that we do on that, you know, it's really trying to figure out how to build resilience and how to build how to adapt people's lives and livelihoods to this new reality. So, you know, in the global north, you know, we talk a lot about mitigation and absolutely right, but here it's already very much adaptation work, because we're already dealing with it. And even though we're not a large polluter now, but also we do a lot of work on mitigation, because you know, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, we have huge populations, and we do end up we do end up doing quite a bit of that as well. So my work is mostly around sort of re-looking at how we provide financial services and also how we do poverty programming and specifically social protection. So if you look at countries in the global south, whether they're in Africa or Asia, most countries spend quite a lot of money, 3–4% of GDP on social protection, for example, right? But most social protection programs are completely, the design is completely inappropriate. The targeting is completely wrong. And we're just, trying to figure out how do we change some of these programs to build resilience among the people that need those programs, right? So how do we cut out the waste and how do we better design social protection programs? So even before more funding flows in, and I don't want to say for a second that we don't need a lot more money coming in to fund some of these programs, but already there is a lot of money that's being wasted on badly designed social protection programs. So that's one part of my work, is looking at, how to go from, this kind of cash transfer, giving people little drips every month for the rest of their lives, and these programs are perennial and you can never come out of them. Because they're not designed to build resilience. They're not designed to move you out of that situation that they just somehow support you to carry on surviving at a very basic level, and how we move from that to productive social protection. So that's one part. And I think that's gaining a lot of currency globally now, which is great to see, because the multilaterals, the global development community is starting to look at this and seeing how we can do more of that. And the other part of my work is on financial inclusion. So how do we build financial products, whether they're in savings, credit, insurance as well? How do we provide, poor people who are going to have, rainfall when it's not supposed to rain, and when they're going to have flooding, and when they're going to have cyclones? How do we provide insurance services which allow them to cope with that shock and those risks? At this point in time, all of that is difficult because, everything is changing. Everything changed, right? And if I give you one example, if you start to develop an insurance product for poor communities in the coastal belt of Bangladesh right now, I mean, the way the frequency of disasters are changing, the premium costs are so high that it doesn't make sense. I mean, you couldn't get them to buy insurance at market rates and be able to cover their risk, right? So it's also, how do we get money into subsidizing the things that would actually build resilience over time? And that's kind of some of the areas that I'm working on. So very quickly, I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Fantastic. There was something you said right early on in your presentation about designing how money is spent. It's not just the amount of money, but it's to what end that money goes. And I think that could be a really helpful way of perhaps linking in the various different interests we have on the panel. It strikes me there's two key questions. How money's made, how do we generate value, wealth, how do we even define those terms, and then how do we go about creating it? But then how do we also spend money, either us personally or our pension funds? Where does that go and how can we influence that? Oana, can I ask you, and by all means, everyone just jump in as and when you feel, but how do I describe it? I've been told it's a provocation, but that doesn't seem quite right. Your artistic kind of expression, your story. It struck me there's a tension there between our individual actions and the systems in which we operate. And however well-meaning we're trying to be, we keep on butting against systems that are pushing against what we want to do. How do you resolve that tension? And is it a tension we should worry ourselves about? Should we just do what we think's right in our own lives, in our own personal spending and the way we generate value? Or should we be more concerned about the sort of work that Suzanne's doing at a macro level of changing kind of the economic system, and how would we do that as individuals? I just wonder if you've got something to say about this individual behavior versus structural change.
This was one of the things I came up against both as an economist and as a novelist. The way ultimately the systems, they reflect ourselves. They don't exist in a vacuum. And yes, you can legislate and change the way a system operates. You can make it more environmentally friendly, or you can make it more respectful of human rights, of minorities, of other countries. But these legal changes will not come about unless the voters will want to vote in people who change the laws in that direction. So I think it all starts with our individual choices. And the tension in this dialogue comes from, and it's something I've just encountered in speaking to people, whether it's climate change or other aspects, where they want to do the right thing, but they will stop at the first excuse, if you will, where it's not, we're not used to having to make sacrifices. We live in the West at a time when, you know, we're not struggling to survive really, most of us, and it's difficult to accept that there are things you have to give up in order to make a difference for the climate. Whether it's through voting or, you know, for instance, making climate change the most important issue in elections. It really should be that. But a majority of people would vote for having their taxes reduced. But if you ask them, they would still say that climate change is the most important issue for them. But it's not. If you voted with another thing in mind, that was not the case. And I think the process that has to happen is that we, and this is where fiction plays a very important part, is to make people emotionally respond to the crisis that's happening in the natural world, and to start caring about it in a way, in the same way that we care about ourselves or about our neighbors or about our family, to have the same sort of care for the natural world. Yes, so this is what prompted that sort of structure and the dialogue. And
I wonder if Suzanne or Shameran, you've got some views from the global south about some of the this level of concern we have for the climate as individuals, that it's still to an extent intellectual in the global north. It's not affecting our lives directly, but we can see where it's going. When you're talking to indigenous people, or you're talking to your clients in Bangladesh who are seeing the impacts already, do they have a very different attitude towards both the issue and how it might be resolved, i.e. whether they should be doing something, or whether there's a top-down solution from big business or big regulators, governments, is the answer?
Yeah, I could start a little bit. I think it's really important to understand that many of us who are people of colour, even in the global north, we hold dual identities. Like, I am diaspora from the Punjab. So right now I'm seeing my elders, they've been sat outside for 6 months in a pandemic trying to fight for labour laws around farming. So our communities, I think this idea that the climate crisis is new isn't necessarily for us. Like I said, I've been working with communities who've been trying to protect their land since 1492. So that's one thing to understand, is that communities of colour, although we're on the front line of the impacts, we've also been on the front line of the strategies, while also being the most economically disadvantaged in the West as well. So I think this idea that who needs to make a personal sacrifice, if we haven't already been making that sacrifice, and also making sure that we're not sort of picking off the individual things. And I think a good example is flying. I remember I got a lot of flack from the climate movement, like, oh, you shouldn't be taking flights. After they've seen all the world with their middle-class parents, suddenly we shouldn't be flying. Some of us need to fly. I had to fly to the tar sands, I had to fly to the Arctic. So we have to balance out who we're putting the shame and blame on, trying to understand if people aren't already taking action, you might not see it. And also the fact that, you know, through the pandemic, we've been living through also watching our communities, watching the Sundarbans go through 2 cyclones during a pandemic and trying to respond to that. So I think we need to complicate that a little bit about accountability. And a lot of this work isn't visible as well. So we have to be careful about blaming people for not taking accountability, and make sure we're pushing on the people who are holding the most resources together, of course, in resistance.
Shameran.
Yeah, From my point of view, I mean, being in the global south, I think sometimes I feel like, there's more greater awareness now in the global north about some of these issues than I see even here. I mean, I'm from Bangladesh, and this country is going to be one of the worst affected by climate change. But for most people, I mean, at least for most of the people in the middle class and upper middle class, even in this country, there's very little awareness of this. I mean, if you look at government programs, I mean, even in our country, which is going to be one of the worst affected, climate isn't the top issue in politics. It's not even, I'd be surprised if it's one of the top 5 issues in politics. It's all about economic growth and infrastructure and all of that. I mean, everything that's gone on in the last few years in Europe with the almost like an awakening. I mean, I'm still waiting for some of that to happen. And we ourselves are to blame for that as well, because we don't talk about it as it should be talked about. But again, I think, if you talk about it to people, there's a very clear, retort, which is, we're not the polluters, we're not the emitters, that's being done by people in the West, and we're just the victims of it, and we should just get more money. And ultimately we've got to take our own responsibility and do what we need to do to protect ourselves. So I think this kind of victim mentality, it doesn't really help. So we've got to get ahead of this, as I said. And, as you were saying, in response to my first set of comments, I mean, yeah, absolutely right. We could get a lot more financing, we could get a lot more funds in, but if we don't know what to do with them, if we don't know how best to spend and create resilience and create a green sort of recovery out of the pandemic, out of all these disasters, we'll end up wasting a lot of that money. And why should the global north pay for the global other ways? I mean, a lot of that as well. So we also have to show that we have the wherewithal, the knowledge to be able to use that money well. And I think, the responsibility lies as much with us as it does with the global north. I'm not, I don't want to blame the side all the time.
I'm keen to bring Emily in on the question of circularity with this challenge between individual action and kind of structural systems. But before I lose you, Shameran, you've designed a money system that answers the real problems that we care about endemic poverty, about resilience, about adapting to climate change. When it comes to looking for creative new ideas and innovators, places like Bangladesh and your microfinance system are famous. What stops us just rewriting how finance works to have a pro-poor lens like you have in Bangladesh, the work of BRAC? Why can't we change that macro system through models that you're developing to answer the very questions that concern us, the world,
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'm not sure, Oliver, I've got the answer to that, other than to say maybe our existing systems are so ingrained and so embedded that it's hard to just take, scrap that and do the kinds of things we're doing. But I think just picking up on that point, I think a lot of the innovation will happen in the global south. It'll happen in Africa, it'll happen in Asia, it'll happen in Latin America, because, it's communities dealing with these issues on a daily basis that are going to have to find the way, out of these crises. And we're seeing a lot of great innovation happening all over the world, not just in Bangladesh. And I think a way to highlight some of that and scale some of that as well is also very important. So how do we get the funding to be able to scale a lot of great ideas? Because there's always talk of innovation. If you're continuously innovating, who's scaling the innovations that actually work? And I think that's also something we've got to talk about.
What can we do, Emily? That's a great segue. Well, how do we scale circular models in the consumption area? That's what most of us watching this, we do. We go out, we spend our money. We can choose to buy something and keep it in the cupboard and use it once a year, or we can share it or borrow it or lease it. There's a strong message to regulators and to consumer brands from this kind of behavior. Do you see that scaling up into new business models, or is it sort of still quite fringe? We'll go and buy our IKEA junk, but might take the table back at the end of 10 years and sell it in a second-hand area in the corner of the store?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely so important, and I think we've seen from the pandemic in the West that we were forced to use what was readily available to us because we couldn't go to the supermarket. So there was a huge reduction in waste because we were thinking, well, I might as well use what's in my cupboard. I'll get that old tin of beans out from the back of the cupboard because that's more viable than me going to the supermarket and buying more. And so we need to consume better, and we need to engage more with those models of leasing products rather than buying them, or subscription-based services rather than purchasing entirely new. You know, in the UK, we have Blockbuster where you would go and rent a video for the weekend, and now we have Netflix where everything is virtual and you don't have to actually buy a product. It's a lease-based model, it's a subscription service. And so I think thinking about those new ways of thinking is definitely the way forward. It's just whether they're implemented in reality is the different question. Kate Raworth's model of donut economics, where you have individual need and individuals whose needs aren't being met in the middle of the donut, and the planetary boundaries on the outside, is a really novel way of looking at our economy, where, you know, the edible part of the donut is the safe space where we are consuming what we need, but we are also doing so within the boundaries of our planet. So it's marrying the two and encouraging a shift in a perception of organizations to acquire that mindset and see that just, you know, producing new products is not the way forward and is not a sustainable model for the future of our planet.
Yeah. There's a term cropped up a couple of times in the various presentations, was the question of accountability. We can be accountable individually for how we spend our money, but there are bigger interests than us who, Suzanne, your work is trying to hold them to account. What are the best ways we can do that, either as individuals or as voters or as pension holders? What do you feel is the most effective, in your experience, has been the most effective way, particularly of using your money to hold the powers to account, the powers that are fixing our economy in the way it is?
I think it's a real tension, and I think it comes back to these superstructures that we're talking about. And if we look at corporate law, these corporations are legally bound to return a dividend. So Shell is legally bound to do whatever it takes, kill people, destroy the land, whatever, to return those dividends back to those people. So at the moment, actually what they're doing is lawful. So we have to think about completely changing the legal system. So one interesting conception is around ecocide and actually making the devastation of territories illegal. So we need to change the whole legality around money. So one way that we've pushed shareholders has had to be looking at the future costs of heavy oil, the risk assessment, the risk involved. And that was also what was really useful with the insurance industry, we got them to stop underwriting new coal projects and new tar sands projects because of the risk associated with that. So that's where this shape shifting comes in as well. You need to, with shareholders, hit the bottom belt with that, with insurance industries, show where the industry is going. But in terms of this superstructure, that's a wider question. How do we change the law where actually corporations don't have more rights as people? And that's going to require a whole paradigm shift. And, you know, where the impetus for cryptocurrency in a sense comes from is, how do we actually devolve this power? How do we decentralize power? Because it's not going to change, as we're seeing, without a lot more deaths and a lot more devastation to the land. So I don't think that's easily questionable, but one way of being accountable is to work with those communities who are trying to fight settler colonialism. That's why the Amazon is being destroyed. That's why the Canadian tar sands, and that even stretches to what's happening in Gaza. So understanding how our connection and solidarity with those movements is connected to also protecting land as well.
Yeah. Oana, I wanted to ask a question about crypto, just on the back of what Suzanne said, that it might be a mechanism for greater accountability. Is that your view? It's obviously something you played with in your introduction. And on top of that as well, just building on that introduction, if our macro system is in essence a reflection of our own values and our own mindsets, How do you hope your work in the creative space can change those mindsets in order that we have different expectations and different demands on our regulators and businesses? So cryptocurrency and mind shift.
I don't think the cryptocurrencies are a vehicle for changing the system for the better. If you look at who are the main backers of crypto, it's some of the wealthiest people on the planet. They've not had to suffer from the existing systems. They've had huge gains from it. And also now when it's growing based on small investors who have savings and who are hoping to make a quick buck. I don't think, taking that into account and looking at the impact of cryptocurrency on the climate, last year it consumed as much energy as Holland. Holland, I think, is in the top 15 global economies. It's a huge impact for no return whatsoever in terms of jobs, or for me, it seems insane to promote that as a new industry. I cannot believe that at the junction that we are today, this is something that is growing. In many ways, the situation today with climate change reminds me of what things were like in communist countries in 1989, after the revolution, after the fall of communism, when people thought that there would be an abrupt change and immediately their lives would become as in the West, not knowing that 40 years of doing damage to social structures, to the environment, would actually result in more pain before things would improve for the better. And this is where we're at now, when we think that we're imagining that there will be a quick fix, that cryptocurrency is, because it offers a financial return, it's something that is helpful. It's not. You have a quick gain, and then we will be in the same situation that we were with the oil industry, where we have to fix this enormous problem,
And you can write op-eds about this, or you can lecture your friends about this, but you've chosen to write creatively on these subjects. Why did you do that? Why didn't you stick in your advisory job?
Because when you address these questions head on, people have a defensive reaction. And from saying, well, you fly, or you have kids, or it's not a rational response. It doesn't actually address the problem. If you present someone with arguments, you expect them to reply to the arguments. But because it's such a sensitive issue, immediately when you blame someone for something, when you say it's your fault that this happened, the reaction is defensive. With fiction, you can show a situation and have a shortcut to the way they respond to it emotionally that bypasses these defensive mechanisms. So they will actually, well, if it's done well, they can understand the situation and be more objective in how they perceive it, how they perceive the solutions. I think fiction is privileged in that way.
And I wonder if there's something to be said about how our behavior affects our thinking. The assumption is we do what we do because we have a logical sort of process, but it's not always the case. Sometimes we behave in a way that then influence, we see, actually, this is a better way of living, or I wish I did this more. Why don't I do it more? Well, because the system is pushing me to do it in a different way. And I'd be very interested to sort of just explore in this last few minutes, and do put questions. If you've got any questions, I'm still looking inside, I haven't seen any. On the circularity piece, do you hope, Emily, that the more I get into leasing stuff and borrowing it and sharing it rather than buying it and owning it, my attitude will change to consumption and more broadly to money in general, how much I need. I won't need as much if I'm not being pushed to go and buy all the time. And Shameran, in Bangladesh, circular economy is just like the everyday. You recycle because presumably you can't go and afford a new bicycle, you just fix the old one. And the problem is that we look to the West where they're consuming all, and we think that's a great thing. We think that's what we want. We do want a new bicycle every year. It's strangely, there's a sort of, that's a mindset issue, essentially. Emily, you're trying to persuade people don't have to buy everything, you can share it. whilst you're facing probably, I want an extra loan because I want to go and buy this new thing when I actually could just fix it. What's your response? Was both, so starting with you, Emily, what do you feel the potential of behaving in buying into the circular economy and practices will influence our thinking about consumption more broadly?
I mean, that would be the dream, Oliver, if that could influence individual thinking and encourage a shift towards, living in that way, then that would be brilliant. But I think we also have to be careful that we, there's only so much we can do as individuals. And if we are too ambitious or too extreme in what we can do, then it becomes too overwhelming. And then we are right back to square one. So, if it's viable for you to cycle to work, then cycle to work. But if you can't, then there are other things that you can do in your lives to, reduce your impact on the planet and think about what's achievable within your own boundaries. A colleague of mine delivers a program to primary school children called UNCO2, which looks at encouraging young children to learn more about climate change. And there's a tension within that about thinking about how that can be overwhelming for young children to learn and perhaps too, emotionally distressing. But then at the same time, there's limited education and awareness about climate change at such a young age. And so it's about changing mindsets and thinking about what's possible within your own life, but also being aware of what you can do as an individual. And the hope is that, yes, that will ultimately shift towards an increased usage of more circular principles.
Brilliant. Having just said, Shameran, I will come to you, but having just said, put your questions in the chat. I see there's a question and answer, so apologies, you've been waiting for you to answer a question. So there's an anonymous attendee that's put, and this, Shameran, will fit into, I think, your response. Does there need to be, or could there be, a shift in self-perception of individuals as a bottom-up drive in order to see some change come into place? Feelings of success or worth, for example. And it goes on. This question of success or worth, we identify in the north with consumption and with having a bigger house and a faster car and going on foreign holidays. I presume it's not that different in Bangladesh. You just, at the moment, not everyone can access that.
It's exactly the same. All right. I mean, you've seen that in China, you've seen that in India, you're seeing that now in Bangladesh and other parts of the world. I mean, with greater economic, greater economic mobility, people having greater sort of higher incomes. And, Bangladesh, like most parts of Asia has seen sort of 20, 25 years of sustained growth now, to the point where, there are, I mean, if you come to Bangladesh now, as opposed to 20 years ago, the number of cars on the roads, the number of, bigger homes, even, the number of air conditioners and refrigerators and motorbikes and, people traveling. Even in rural communities, even in poor communities, you go into a home and they've got a small refrigerator. I mean, so that's happening. And that is the aspiration of upward economically mobile people, where the better off you are, you live in a better home, you have greater appliances, you have cars and motorbikes, and you travel. And I think that's what I was saying, that for a long time, we had this feeling that we're not the polluters, we're not the emitters. Those are the US and Europe and places like that, and we're just the victims. But when 170 million people in Bangladesh become economically more, and then 1.3 billion in India, another 200 million in Pakistan, and if you look through the rest of Asia, become economically better off and more active and start doing all of this, we will become large emitters and large polluters. So it's not, that's what I was saying, that yes, we have to work on the adaptation side, but we also in the South need to look at our mitigation efforts, our personal choices in the way we live our lives, because it's a huge population and it's developing very fast.
One of my few jobs is to make sure that we finish on time. The other one is to stop you fighting, and because you're all in different rooms, that's fine. I think we managed that. But I've got one biggie for the last 4 or 5 minutes, and it comes from a question from Robert Alexander, who flags up that basically greed is at the center of this. Our own greed, the greed of the institutions and the businesses that we support. The promise of the low carbon transition, especially in a Western kind of view, is that we can carry on basically being greedy. We can just design out the negative impacts through technological advances, through clever sort of finance mechanisms, through interesting circular consumption patterns. We can have everything we want and keep within a one planet system. Is that basically a false story? Are we going to have to get used to the idea that we need to sacrifice, we need to spend less, earn less, travel less, do everything a bit less? Or actually, is that story valid, that we can have everything if we're clever enough?
Well, I've already said I don't think there's a pain-free transition.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And oh, sorry, are you carrying on?
Yeah, do.
And I think we've already seen that if we look at electric cars and the rush for lithium and the indigenous rights that were devastated in that, that's already a clear example that the transition is carrying on with a lot of the same mentalities of extraction and devastation as well. And I think we saw it with the pandemic, that was an instance where we all needed to make a sacrifice for the collective, and some of us did and some of us didn't. And I think it's a good foreshadowing of what is happening with the climate crisis. And we're seeing the same people who are on the bottom having to make the sacrifices, already seeing the impacts, and other people being immune from it. But essentially, I think it's about reimagining the relationship with the landscape, with resources, and making sure that exactly that's the role of the creative, and right, why we need these spaces of the novel, of other places, to imagine into the complexity of these problems, so that we're not replicating it in the solutions, which is what's happening at the moment. And it also needs that space for out of the box thinking. Like, we've never had to face fascism, climate change in a pandemic before. So we're going to have to also be interdisciplinary in our thinking. And that means more spaces like this where we get to think with other people and challenge our knee-jerk reactions to technologies and to ways of being that might actually hold solutions for us as well.
Can I ask about this pain point? Can we rephrase it? Can we rethink that we need to change, but it doesn't have to be a painful transition? We can transition to something that makes us happier, that's better for everyone, that it feels, because our expectations are such that we're going to have to lose out, but actually we could gain. And if that is the case, how are we going to present that? Are there any lessons maybe from indigenous communities or circular economy fans, or from Bangladesh, where, you know, you're not actually losing out, we're gaining something in a way? And if that is the case, how are we going to sell that story?
One possible route is to, I think this was mentioned before, giving the natural world ecosystems similar rights to those we enjoy. But it has to happen the other way around. We have to start thinking of them as similar in worth to ourselves. And then it's not like we're not envious of our fellow humans that they enjoy the same rights as we do. And we have to reach the same position versus the natural world, where we will not think that they don't deserve being treated with the same care and attention and respect that we do. And if we reach that point, then no, I don't think anyone misses slavery today. No one is, well, maybe there are a few, but a majority of people do not do that, do not see that as a loss. And we will gradually reach the same point with respect to the natural world. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where it has to happen quite quickly.
I think
quick show of hands, because we've got 2 minutes. Who thinks monetizing social environmental goods and downsides is a good idea? Just put your hand up if you think it's a good idea. Split down, great. The other thing, we did obviously ask all the G7 leaders to join us today for an interdisciplinary chat, but the white men in their suits doing their thing. So if we have one message from each of you, if you've got 20 seconds each, what's your message to the G7 to get our money system, our economy, onto a track that will deliver the kind of world that we want, a world where people are included and the planet can survive? Easy question to finish with. One thing.
I would say systems change, linking in with everything change, and linking our, social and environmental goals with our economic ones as well.
Yeah.
I would say
the short term of your mandate.
you can't eat and drink money.
Brilliant. That's your headline. And Shameran?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, given the time we're in, most developing countries are starting to look inwards again because everyone's gone through this pandemic. And I think we just need a little bit more global thinking and, again, systems change. And don't just think about your own economies, think about the world, because the needs are more urgent now.
Brilliant. Look, guys, that was fantastic. Thank you all so much. We're up against the hour. We could carry on for yonks. I did say the G7 leaders were invited. They might well have joined. Who knows? I don't know. Those that put questions. Elaine, you have a question. I'm going to put that to Arma afterwards about crypto. I'm sorry we didn't get your questions answered. We're so grateful for you joining us. We're thankful to the organisers at Swansea University for making this happen. We're especially grateful for our panellists today for all your insights. We'll do this again next year or whenever we can. All the best with everything you're doing to open up discussion and make change in this area. It is so important, and keep fighting against those white guys with ties and think they've got all the answers. So thank you all very much. Thanks guys for listening, and do log on to the other events. There's I think 8 or 9 events over the next 10 days. You'll find them on the website. Thanks very much.